right, everyone, we're going to get started with session 2. Welcome to Linked Lives and Interconnections, our second oral session for this morning. I'm Sarah James, a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Minnesota, where I'm part of the Minnesota Pop Center, studying the ways that day-to-day activities, in particular our sleep, contribute to racial disparities in health. I'm excited to be welcoming 4 great presenters for our session today. I'll be introducing each of them before their presentation. Our first presentation will be from Dr. Audrey Dorelien, who is a professor here in the Humphreys School at the University of Minnesota. She studies how human population dynamics and behavior intersect with environmental conditions to affect health, with her current research particularly focusing on early life exposures such as disease, nutrition, and climate effects on health, both in the United States and sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you, everyone. Today, I'm going to present some work on my latest research trends, which ties human population dynamics and behavior with infectious disease. So this is work with graduate student Ashwini here, and it's looking at racial and ethnic differences in social contact patterns and implications for the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. So racial disparities in COVID cases and therefore mortality have been a persistent feature of the pandemic. So this is a picture from, I believe, May 2020, but we've seen that this has continued to be the fact that certain people in certain age groups, especially the younger age groups or Black and Latino population, have been adversely affected, specifically where we see higher case rates than we would expect. Okay. And this is important because ethnic and racial disparities are likely driven by higher COVID-19 exposures, especially among certain age groups. So this is why I'm really interested in studying social contact patterns. So those are interpersonal contacts, because that actually is a really big component of modeling, or just basically if you want to understand how infectious disease, particularly respiratory pathogens, are transmitted. So in terms of for infectious disease modelers and then for respiratory infectious disease, basically we know that disease transmission risk is proportional to many aspects of social contact. So people study the number of contacts that people have, the duration, and nature. So whether or not that contact is casual, close, or physical. And the key here is that different aspects of social contact patterns may actually vary by race and ethnicity. But unfortunately, this has not been well studied worldwide. And actually, especially in the US, we've not been studying US social contact patterns at all. So now the COVID and the influenza infectious disease models, those actually all rely on social contact patterns for Europe, which has a very different demographic composition, and also, socially is very different. So in terms of our contribution in this paper, we used the American Time Use survey to actually analyze contacts at home, work, public. So public I'll define as like indoor, enclosed location, and also other locations that fall in other. So those might be like outdoor settings, or also some other high-risk settings like someone else's home. Because we're using the American Time Use survey, we measure actual duration of social contacts. And the key for duration of social contacts outside of the home, we actually don't have information on the total number of contacts that people have. And then also another aspect of the Time Use survey is that we have allow for information on occupation. So we're also able to look at the effect of employment status and also occupation on social contacts. Okay. So I'm going to first give you, so some of the questions that we want to ask is like, why are Black and Hispanics infected at a much higher rates? So it's really trying to tease out whether or not where the ethnic differences are. Are they in their household, community, or workplace exposures? And just to preview the results, because of the timing for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the results for workplace exposures, because we find that it's actually workplace exposures that are driving racial disparities in social contacts. First, we see that there are large differences in the location of work activities and whether or not those activities occurred in the presence of others. Second, we find that higher exposure at work is not explained by differences in occupation, age, or sex. And we find that Black and Hispanic respondents had higher COVID-19 exposure risk at work, even when they had the same occupation as white. So just to highlight, in the broader paper project, we look at exposures in many different settings, but today I'll just present on the findings for the workplace. The American Time Use Survey, it's a nationally representative survey. It's a sample of the CPS households. I am using data from 2019 and 2020, and I have about 8 to 10,000 observations per survey. 2021 data just became available, so we haven't yet incorporated that, but we will in the future. And I have information on respondents age 15 and older that are non-institutionalized. And throughout the analysis, I use the survey weights just because they oversample on the weekends and oversample certain populations. So in order for it to be representative, we use the survey weights. And individuals are asked about their activities on the previous day. Okay. So in terms of comparing the 2019 and 2020 data, I find that the demographic characteristics were very similar. So there were no differences by sex, age, race, ethnicity, or household composition. So that's very good. But where we did notice differences, and that's not a surprise. So in 2020, there was a higher proportion of individuals that were unemployed or not in the labor force. So because of the pandemic-induced recession, that's expected. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So what is a social contact in the ATUS survey? So basically, I labeled anything a social contact if it was an activity that's done with others. So we have information, was this activity done with someone else? But we were actually a little bit more broad. So if someone said, oh, I went grocery shopping by myself, we consider that a social activity, because if you're going grocery shopping, you may have done that activity by yourself, but you're going in a location that's going to have the presence of other people. And you might interact with the grocery clerk. So any public location, stores, gyms, place of worship, schools, taxis, trains, airplanes, we consider those to be social activities, regardless of if you said you did the activity alone. And so this is just to say that when I'm measuring social contact, that may also, that may do the close interpersonal contact, but I may also be more broadly capturing some airborne transmission. Okay. And just to highlight, I don't have detailed information on the number of contacts, but I have information on duration of social contacts. And other studies have shown that duration of social contacts, that actually is predictive of disease transmission risk. And people have used that information in infectious disease models. Yeah, and the key is to think that the location of contact and the activity can tell you a little bit about the transmission risk. For instance, if I do see racial differences in contacts at home, but you may think that we may not be so concerned about that because that's household member contact. We're going to be more concerned with contacts outside of their household. Okay, so why focus on the workplace? Sorry. Okay, so once again, overall, we find that the pandemic did result in significant changes in the duration of social contacts. People spend less time with others overall, but more time at home with others, so that's expected. There were changes, some of these changes did differ by race and ethnicity. As I mentioned, we care more about non-household member contacts. And then when we did look at racial differences in exposures, those were not driven by differences in patterns for public indoor location or other. So those results, we did not see large racial differences. So all groups reduce duration of social contacts at work, but you can see that the white respondents reduced that to a larger degree, so 29%. And then pre-pandemic, Blacks had the lowest duration of social contacts at work, but you can, but that pattern changed in 2020. But this is because here I'm looking at the population overall, so that's influenced by labor force. You know, there might be a higher proportion that are unemployed. Okay, sorry. So then you also see that during the pandemic, you see that especially the working age population, you see a big difference between 2019 and 2020 for white respondents, but you don't see actually that difference. So this is looking at the data overall for Black respondents. So this is just to highlight that white respondents working age were significantly able to reduce their social contacts, but not that wasn't the case for Black respondents. In our model, we control for age group, sex, labor force status, household size, and presence of children under 18. And looking at 2019, we say after adding controls, including employment status, Black respondents had similar duration of work social contacts as whites in 2019. But we see that differences in employment status, so differences in employment status contributed to a 2019 Black-white difference in duration of work contacts. But when you look at 2020, you see that Black and Hispanic respondents had longer duration of work contacts compared to white respondents. So definitely 2020 is different. So compared to whites and other group, Black respondents were basically not able to decrease their 2020 duration of work contacts to a similar extent when I have a model where I include interaction terms. So everything I was showing you before, I was showing you duration of social contacts for the overall population. Here I'm doing, in the next few slides, I'm just going to show you for employed individuals who actually went to work that day. And I'm actually, so this is just to show you that there was a big difference in social contacts between 2019 and 2020. And I'm going to focus on the at work. So you see that in, yes, okay. All right, so if you see in 2019, the majority of work activities takes place in the presence of others and at the workplace, so compared to at home. So here I broke it down in social contacts and then alone. Okay. But then you see that in 2020, there was a slight increase actually in the total minutes spent working for most groups. But then time spent working alone increased, especially at home. And I'm going to break those down a little bit more. Hispanic employed respondents had greater duration of social contact at work compared to whites in 2019 and 2020. But Black and Hispanic respondents had the lowest decrease in social contact duration at the workplace, with a decrease of about 42 minutes, 13%, and 54 minutes, 15% respectively. And then when I do the regression, I see that all the racial differences driven by differences in occupation. So here, since I have everyone who's employed, we see that no, that's not the fact. So within occupation, we're seeing racial differences in contacts exist. So the pandemic may actually have exacerbated racial disparities in work contacts. The pandemic may have exacerbated racial disparities in work contacts. So here I don't see something in the interaction term, but that's because I don't have enough power. The magnitude of the results are big. All right. So I just want to make two more points. There were some factors with intersectionality where I saw that for the Hispanic results, it was mostly driven by men, not women, not Hispanic women. And overall, I just want to highlight that policies should really focus on reducing workplace exposures. And that's in line with some of the findings by Noreen Goldman and others, Hawkins, Davis, and Peeble. And I just want to finish with that. So in future studies will look at whether and what might explain those differences, especially after we control for occupation. So thank you.
Next, our presenter will be joining us virtually. And as we're getting that technology set up, I'll go on and introduce him. So Bin Shu is a PhD candidate from the Lehigh University Department of Economics. His research focuses on health economics and the application of microeconomic methods to evaluate and inform public policy. He works in areas such as physician referral behaviors, public policy and mental health, and the influence of health information technology. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Right. Sure. Thanks for having me. So today I'm going to share with you our latest findings about the intergenerational causal effect about the family size. So our research topic is about whether more grandchildren means more happiness for the grandparents, and we use the data from China. Okay, so a brief introduction. We are trying to target at two age groups and two pricing issues in Chinese economy. They are the low birth rate, so the newborns, and then the aging population. So currently, China is facing an inverted pyramid social structure. So we are trying to use this paper to link those two age groups. And more specifically, we're trying to examine one old saying in Chinese culture. It is called more grandchildren, more happiness. So if you look at the artwork on the right-hand side of the screen, so that gives you one of the most popular topic and wishes that we give people in the Spring Festival. So one of the most important festival in China, and we will say that I wish you have more grandchildren, I wish you have more descendants, and that means that kind of implies that more grandchildren definitely means more happiness for that family. So we want to examine, we ask whether this old saying still holds in the modern context. Our research question is that does having more grandchildren improves the mental health status of the elderly? So here is a brief history of China's birth control policies. So after the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese government had been promoting childbirths in hope of a larger labor force and more productive power. However, in 1970s, the growing population became a problem. So the population size hit 1 billion mark in 1973, and the second generation of the Chinese leadership, led by Deng Xiaoping, just decided to curb the growing population by legislation. So in 1979, there was this very famous one-child policy put into law, and that policy lasted for more than 30 years. In 2014, the Chinese government decided to kind of relax the restriction of this child birth control, and we had a pilot policy called the selective two-child policy, which means that if the parents, both of the parents, they are the only child of their own families, then they can have a second child. And in 2016, we have this universal two-child policy, which means, so no matter what, you can now have a second child. So we want to examine this variation in grandchildren numbers on the mental health status of the grandparents. So what is known in the literature? First of all, we know that with more grandchildren, the elderly are more likely to take various tasks on intergenerational caregiving. So we examined caregiving as a mechanism in our robustness check. So the second strand of research basically affirmed the old saying, and a lot of correlational studies found that so having more grandchildren improves the mental health status of the grandparents. However, some researchers, especially in the developed countries, they found that supplementary assistance in caring grandchildren are associated with elevated depressive symptoms. So there are this kind of debates and conflicts. So we want to solve this puzzle by trying to identify the causal effect of having more grandchildren. Okay, so here are our contributions. We are trying to identify the intergenerational causal effect of having more grandchildren on the grandparents' mental health using an instrumental variable approach. Secondly, we use the panel data, so that kind of resolved the selection bias on the mental health status and the physical health status of grandparents. And then more importantly, we are trying to control for the childbearing intentions and willingness of the sandwich population of the parents. So we control for individual fixed effect, year fixed effect, and more importantly, we control for geographic variation by controlling for this community year fixed effect. And since we have a nationwide data set, we examine the effect of heterogeneities by contrasting rural versus urban grandparents, men versus women, and also high income families versus low income families. And more importantly, we examined the matrilateral biases by comparing the paternal grandparents versus the maternal grandparents. Okay, so our empirical strategy. The data we use comes from the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, the CHELS dataset, which resembles the HRI's dataset in the United States. We have 4 waves of observation from 2011 all the way to 2018. And all subjects study are families with at least one resident who is older than or equal to 45 years old. So here are 3 terminologies that I'm going to use throughout the presentation. G1 stands for the first generation, which means the grandparents. G2 stands for the second generation, the parents or the sandwich population. G3 are the grandchildren. Okay. So the sample size, we have approximately 72,000 G1 year observations. And for each G1, we have around 3 waves of observation. So this is the model setup. YIT or outcome variables will be a set of mental health measures. I is for G1, so we observe, our observation is based on the grandparents, not parents or grandchildren. Okay, and T stands for year. The variable of interest will be the average number of grandchildren. So that is equal to the number of G3 divided by the number of G2 of that of G1. Okay. So we also controlled for a vector of control variables because mental health status is closely related to age. So we added in a flexible control of age. We added in age categories. We also control for demographic information, social economics, labor force, physical health of the grandparents, insurance status, family structure. And also we control for the age of the parents, the age of G2 and the income of G2. So here we have tau T stands for the year fixed effect, alpha I stands for the G1 fixed effect. And also we control for community year fixed effect. We also considered the complex design of the survey. So all of our results will be weighted and will be, all of the standard errors will be clustered. Okay. So the instruments that we use for average number of G3 are 2 policies. Okay, so basically we have 2 instruments. One of them is the selective 2-child policy, came into effect in 2014. The second instrument is the 2016 universal 2-child policy. And our contribution is that instead of using the observed characteristics of G2, so because the 2014 selective 2-child policy select samples based on whether the parents, whether G2 are the only child of the family or not, so that selection itself is endogenous. So we're trying to avoid this issue using the birth cohort of G2. So if a G2 is born after 1979, so they are affected by the 1-child policy, then they are highly likely to be the only child of the family. And they are affected by the 2014 selective two-child policy. So that's the main idea of our instrument construction. Okay. And because we're using the IVE approach, we first examined the relevance assumption of those two IVs. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see the probability of having a second child among G1. So after 1979, you can see there is a sharp drop of the probability of having a second child. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to see a similar plot, which shows the probability of having a second child among G2. So the top right line gives you G2 who are born after 1979. So they are affected by the one-child policy, and they are also exposed to the selective two-child policy. So you're going to find that in 2015, there is an increase in that probability of having a second child. And then that probability goes up further in 2018 after the universal two-child policy. On the contrary, if you look at the bottom blue line, so those are G2 who were born before 1979. So they are not affected by the selective two-child policy, but they are affected by the universal two-child policy. Okay, so here are our main results. Table 1 gives us the first stage results of the IVE regression. We have 3 columns. They give you 3 different specifications. So column 1 gives you the without control model. Column 2 is the two-way fixed effect model where we control for year fixed effect and G1 fixed effect. And column 3 gives you the full specification where we have the community year fixed effect as well. Okay, so all 3 models gives us a very large F statistics of the IVEs. They are all greater than 10. They are around 100. Okay, so this is the first stage result. And then the outcome variables of the second stage. So we are using the CESD-10 mental health measures as our outcomes. So CESD-10 stands for the Center for Epidemiology Studies Depression, and there are 10 questions. So that's why it is called CESD-10. This is one of the most common measures of depressive symptoms used in research, but those measures are all self-reported, so that is one limitation of our paper. So the 10 questions are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. We have whether the grandparents feel depressed, whether they feel everything is an effort, they have restless sleep, they were unhappy, they felt lonely, bothered by little things, could not get going, had trouble keeping mind on what it's doing, feel unhopeful about future, and feel fearful.
And
yes.
we've got about 1 minute for you to wrap up.
Oh, sure. Okay. So we also did a factor analysis where we categorized those 10 questions into 3 categories. So depression, depressed mood, somatic symptoms, and positive effect. So our main findings are that having more grandchildren are negatively affecting the mental health status of the grandparents. So in this graph, all of the positive numbers means that there is an increase in the frequency of feeling bad, okay, among the grandparents. Okay, so the next table, we analyzed the effect of heterogeneity. So we find that the rural grandparents are suffering more from having more grandchildren compared with their urban counterparts. And then surprisingly, all of the burdens seems to be on the grandmothers, whereas the grandfathers are less affected by having more grandchildren. And more importantly, we analyzed the paternal versus maternal grandparents. So we found that the grandmothers of the fathers of the family are mostly affected by having more grandchildren, and the grandfathers of the mothers does not negatively affected by having more grandchildren, but instead they feel kind of happy about having more grandchildren. So our conclusions are 5-fold. So overall, having more grandchildren negatively affects the elderly's mental health, and also rural grandparents suffers more. Grandfathers and grandmothers show different outcomes. Grandmothers feel more depressed, whereas grandfathers, they feel less happy, but not depressed. And we found discrepancies between maternal and paternal grandparents, and we identified the matrilateral biases. And that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank
Our
you.
next presentation will be by Jocelyn Wilder, who is joining us from Newark at the University of Chicago, where she is a senior research scientist. Her background is in epidemiology, and these days she works on the INCHAP survey, as well as issues related to health equity and the racialization of space.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for allowing me to share the research that is conducted with my co-authors, James Iveniuk at Newark and Lissette Piedra at the University of Illinois School of Social Work. There we go. So our research objective was to look at social network differences between older white, Black, and Hispanic adults, and to see if those differences changed over time. And so I'm going to start with the theories informing our research, and I'll talk about INCHAP more when I talk about the research design. So, there's been a theory in the evolution about social networks among older adults. So there's a Cummings and Henry's seminal work portrayed older adults as being withdrawn from others, disengaged, and that they had really little use in the modern American society, and that they preferred to withdraw themselves from the burdensome aspect of social life. And so we've evolved since then to now that we know this was not an accurate assumption. So that we have, older adults are in charge of their social networks. They maintain them and then construct them throughout their life. And that there may be some limitations due to social environment, but they are not withdrawn from the world. And so we've got some more nuanced theories about social networks among older adults. We have the social emotional selectivity theory that says that there's a motivational change in your network. So older adults actually do disinvest from less rewarding relationships, but they also become more active because they have more discretionary time during retirement. To kind of looking at those social networks around engagement, we also have the social disadvantage theories. And these theories posit that persistent social disadvantage also creates unstable relationships. So higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of incarceration inhibit people from actually sustaining connections. So that may actually lead to smaller and kin-focused social networks. And that actually kind of is linked to that finding from the other theories that there are social, environmental, and resource domains that affect people's social networks. Okay. So using those social emotional selectivity and the social disadvantage hypotheses, we hypothesize that Black older adults will have smaller social networks. They would spend more time on average with their contacts, and they would have denser social networks. So it would be more of one type, more family focused, kin focused, and not a large dispersion. And they would have a greater rate of contacts lost, and they would have a greater rate of contacts gained. So they would be losing people and not adding new people to their social networks over time. And we also hypothesized that Hispanic older adults would have more kin-focused networks, and they would also have denser networks. Okay. So what we used was the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. And so it's a population-based probability sample of older adults from 1920 to 1965. We have 3 rounds. We're currently working on the 4th round for 22-23. And we have about 3,000 to 2,001, 1,500 responses respectively over the rounds, and we have about a 75% response rate. And the measures that we used is the NCHAP uses the Important Matters name generator, which is actually asking people to name up to 5 people that they discuss important matters with, and we let them define what those important matters are. And if you can see, and we looked at it over time, so like we have Rob, who was identified as a child in wave 1 of someone, and that person is also identified in wave 2, but people have dropped off. Sometimes people are added over the 3 rounds. And the contacts in the name generator are referred to as alters, and so as we go through, we'll see that, that term. Our main predictors were race, ethnicity, time, interaction between the two, and we controlled for gender, education, age, marriage, and retirement status. This, we collected network size, so the number of people that they identified, time spent on average with their alters, which is number of days per year, their network density, looking at if they had a kind of even between friends, families, and others that they've identified, or if it was very dense among kin. We looked at the proportion of family, which was the number of people identified as relatives divided by the total number of people identified. And we looked at turnover, the proportion that were lost and the proportion that were gained. And you can see we have persistent ties, people who are in all 3 rounds versus new ties. We also captured the sex and sex of the alters. Okay, so our analytical strategy was that in stage 1, we had a multi-level model with time nested in respondents. And this was to address within respondent non-independence. It was a random intercept model, and we used it to predict 6 different network outcomes. The second was the multi-level model with time points nested in alters, nested in respondents. And this was only used for one outcome, days per year spent with an alter. And it also has inverse probability weights to address problems arising from attrition. So overall, the average time spent with the alters fluctuated between rounds. So, and between round 1 and round 2, it decreased by 7 days. When we got to round 3, it went back up to about the same number of days spent per alters as we saw in round 1. The turnover rate between round 1 and 2 were consistent, but we see that between round 2 and 3, there was a 46% turnover rate in the terms of alters lost, and only a 27% terms of alters gained. So people added to people's new networks. And so some of our findings are that if you look at non-Hispanic Blacks and look at network size, they significantly had about 1 less person in their network compared to non-Hispanic whites. Another significant finding was that they spent about 38 more days per year with their alters. And then also we found that proportion of alters lost were that older Hispanic adults lost fewer alters compared to non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic Blacks. We did not find differences in network density. We did not find any differences in proportion of families, so they weren't more kin-focused as we had hypothesized. And we didn't see differences about the alters gained. So another hypothesis that non-Hispanic Blacks are going to lose alters, more alters compared to non-Hispanic whites. We look at the interaction over time and the differences by network size. So we have on the y-axis network size, and then we have the rounds on the x-axis. And what we did see was that at the start of the study in round 1, Hispanics had lower network size, and then they around 2 and to round 3, they increased their network size. Within alter changes, we did not see any interaction between race and time, but it was still consistent that non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanics did spend more time with their alters. So our hypothesis recap. Is that we have smaller social networks among Black older adults, and they spent more time with their contacts. We didn't find denser networks. We didn't find more kin-focused networks. There was no greater rate of contacts lost, and there was no lower rate of contacts gained. Same for the hypothesis that we had around Hispanic older adults were null. We didn't have more kin-focused, and they were not denser. And for both, the gaps did not widen over time. So the implications are that it appears that non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanic older adults have social networks that differ little between each other and over time. This results are different from previous theories, and just that kind of restate that that was only among community dwelling adults, so there was no information on transition into long-term care. And so our conclusions are that kind of we approached this with a deficit kind of model, where we were looking to see differences, though it might be more helpful to go into a research looking at racialized populations without assuming deficits, and maybe do more of a strength-based or assets-based research, and looking at what is leveraged by older adults themselves in their pursuit of well-being, but also recognizing that we are looking at older adults, and as we know with mortality, that there are racial and ethnic disparities in mortality, so that maybe we should be looking at social networks across the life course, because they may look different for someone who's in their 70s versus someone in their 20s and their 40s, because once you've made it into your 70s, you've kind of survived. And I think that is the last. My acknowledgements for the study is that it's through the Inter-University Consortium for Population Research, and the analysis is not pre-registered.
Our final presentation in our session this morning will be by Kelsey Drotning, a PhD student in the sociology department at the University of Maryland. Kelsey studies discrimination, social disadvantage, and institutional violence at the intersection of race and gender, with recent work on how cultural understandings of sexual violence are shifting through the lens of motherhood, and how time diaries can explore issues of social isolation and racial disparities. Hi, everyone. First, thank you to the conference presenters for putting together and organizing this great conference. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Sarah Flood and Dr. Liana who are working with me on this project and providing invaluable input. Over the last several decades, scholars have been interested in research on isolation and loneliness because of the perception that greater social media consumption and changing family norms are leaving people with less connection. Previous research suggests that social interaction is beneficial for health and well-being overall, but we know less about how people feel about their social interactions or their time alone in the moment. Interest in these topics has only increased since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted opportunities for social engagement,
leaving those who live alone with limited opportunity for social interaction and those who live with others with potentially a lack of alone time. Our project contributes to this discussion by examining subjective well-being when people are alone, with family, with non-household family, friends, and others. Association between social isolation and poor mental and physical health. It is vital that we understand how people feel about time spent alone compared to time spent with others across the life course. A large body of research has shown that risk of social isolation increases as people age. In early and middle age, school, work, and family roles provide opportunities for social interaction, but there are fewer of these opportunities later in life following retirement and potentially the loss of a spouse or partner. Additionally, those who live alone must expend more effort to access social interaction opportunities, particularly now when some jobs have shifted to permanent telework. However, spending time with others is not necessarily always positive. There's also some evidence that people may prefer to spend time alone if their social network is prone to conflict and causes greater levels of stress. If people live in a high conflict environment, they may report greater happiness and less stress when alone. But they may also have fewer opportunities to spend time alone. People allocate their time in different activities and with different people based on role constraints, structural inequality, and preferences. Working people can interact with clients and coworkers, and people who don't live alone are likely to interact with an intimate partner or their children or other family members. On the other hand, people who live alone or are unemployed have fewer daily opportunities for social interaction, but they may have greater control over when they spend time with others because there are fewer demands on their time. Research published in 2021 found that when people choose to be alone, they report greater well-being than when they have no option but to be alone. Because gender, race, and class inequality contribute to the roles people take on, they also play an important role in structuring how much control people have over their time and expectations of how they feel about their time. For example, previous research has found that both mothers and fathers highly value time with children, but fathers tend to enjoy this time more because they tend to engage in play and fun activities rather than care activities. Additionally, recent theoretical pieces have suggested that those with privileged identities can gain time by hiring others to complete tasks like housework, while those with less privilege may have to spend more time on activities to make the basic needs. This research on subjective well-being is focused on overall life satisfaction, usually measured using the Cantrell scale or similar measures. More recently, some research has used time diary data to examine hedonic well-being as a way to understand how people feel about spending time in particular activities and with particular people. Hedonic well-being examines current or momentary emotions, and when measured close to the event, is more reflective of the respondent's emotional state. Most of the existing research focuses on parents' time with their spouses and children. Married parents report greater happiness, meaning and less stress when they are with a spouse than when the spouse is not present. And parents also report greater well-being in activities with children than without. This leads us to expect that people report greater well-being when with their family than when they are alone or with non-family. Evidence regarding the association between time spent alone and subjective well-being is less clear. A recent paper found that for couples with children, time with family and non-family is viewed as more enjoyable than time alone. But other research has found that those with busy schedules and greater time demands view time alone positively. Findings on how Americans experience time alone and time with others is needed to understand subjective well-being at different stages across the life course in response to role and structural constraints, and to provide a critical benchmark of how people feel about their social lives during the COVID-19 pandemic. To that end, we investigate two research questions. How does subjective well-being vary by who respondents are with? And how does subjective well-being when respondents are with different types of people vary by living arrangements, gender, and age? Data for this study come from the American Time Use Survey's well-being module, which was fielded in 2010, 2012, and 2013. It was also fielded in 2021, which is really exciting, and we're really looking forward to getting into that data. The well-being module collects well-being information for 3 activities from a respondent's 24-hour time diary. Activities are randomly selected from all non-self-care activities. Well-being is measured on a 7-point scale, ranging from 0 to 7, respondents report how sad, tired, happy they felt during each activity, and how much pain, stress, and how meaningful that activity was to them. For this paper, we're focusing on happiness, stress, and meaning. And we look at this by when respondents are alone, with household family, with non-household family, friends, and others. And that other category kind of captures coworkers, neighbors, people who they aren't very close to. Our sample is white, Black, and Hispanic adults who are 18 plus, who answered subjective well-being questions for all 3 activities. We used random intercept models to examine happiness, stress, and meaning when respondents are alone or with different types of people, and to account for the 3 records per respondent. We present a series of bar charts that show the predicted subjective well-being of respondents when they are with particular people by living arrangement, gender, and life stage. We also, these are our variables. So dependent variables are happiness, stress, and meaning. Our independent variable is with whom they spent time. And then we're looking at this by living arrangements, gender, life stage, and age. And then these are the control variables that we used. I can talk more about those later. So the next charts examine predicted subjective well-being when spending time with others by living arrangements. The subscripts above each bar are listed over here and denote which groups are statistically significantly different from the indicated group. The x-axis labels on the bottom of the chart apply to both levels of the chart also. The top left graph depicts predicted happiness when with different people for those who live alone. People generally report higher levels of happiness across living arrangements. So you can see that on a scale of 0 to 7, people are reporting an average of like 4.5. So people are generally fairly happy. Across the graphs, we can also see that people are happier when they are with others than when they are with alone. And that happiness is greatest when people are with non-household family or friends. Happiness does not differ between friends or non-household family across these living arrangement groups. So it appears that non-household family or friends are evaluated at a similar level. Whereas household family, because people are living with them, don't have quite the same happiness bump as those people you don't see on a regular basis. Generally, those who live with a partner are the happiest, but this is relative because, again, the happiness distribution is fairly narrow. This is the same type of graph, but we're looking at stress. So generally, respondents report low levels of stress across living arrangements. So again, on that 0 to 7 scale, we're looking at around a 1 or a 1.5. Single parents report the highest levels of stress overall. So that's this bottom left-hand corner. And those who live with only a partner report the lowest levels of stress overall. Across living arrangements, respondents report the highest level of stress when they are with other people, like coworkers, roommates, or neighbors. So we're probably seeing a big coworker spike here with the stress level at work. And the lowest levels of stress occur when people are with their friends. Stress levels were similar when people were alone or with non-household family. Again, this is the same type of graph, but with meaning. So predicted meaning by living arrangements shows a similar pattern to happiness, with lowest meaning when people are alone and the highest meaning when people are with friends or non-household family. Those who live with their children only report the highest, those who live with their children only report the highest levels of meaning across living arrangements. And these findings suggest that people value time with friends and non-household family most, rather than when they are alone or with people they already live with. Next set of graphs show happiness by gender and life stage. Spending time alone is still associated with the least happiness, regardless of gender or age group. Overall, though, women are happier than men, and happiness increases with age. Women report the highest levels of happiness when with friends and non-household family. However, men report the highest level of happiness when with friends, but less happiness than with non-household family. Women over age 55 are significantly happier than men of the same age. Okay. While women are happier overall than men, they are also more stressed. Stress levels decrease after age 55, and women are more stressed when alone than when they are with household family, while men report similar levels of stress when alone with family across age groups. Men report significantly less stress than women after age 65. The previous slide showed that women report greater happiness and more stress than men. We also found that women report greater meaning than men. Additionally, the meaningfulness of activities increases with age, like happiness. Happiness, the greatest levels of meaning are found when spending time with non-household family and friends, while the lowest levels of meaning are reported when respondents are alone. To conclude, men and older adults are more socially isolated than other groups, but there is evidence that of more time with family. People are happier, less stressed, and find more time more meaningful when they are alone, when they're not alone. And together, our findings suggest that time with others and associated subjective well-being has really complex links with familial roles and life stage. Our findings establish a baseline for subjective well-being prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now that we have the 2021 ADIS data, we can look at how that has changed following the COVID-19 pandemic.